Welcome to Final Fantasy 15 Dawn of the Future, Part 4. We are beginning episode Luna Freya, or as it is titled in book, Choosing Freedom. And this is the cover image. There's only one cover image I'm not going to use, and that's going to be episode Noctis, because I'm going to wait to unveil that one. So as we get further and further in the stories, there is less and less art, sadly, because the concept, like, they had started development on episode Aranea, so they had more artwork, and episode Arden was already done, so they had a ton of artwork. But yeah, so we're gonna get less and less art, sadly, but I'll have a few little goodies afterwards. So I was laughing at the beginning because my chat is, I love my chat. So yeah. Choosing Freedom. Once again, not doing accents. Sorry. The ocean's depths are much like the sky. As light passes through water, the playful shimmers trace the same graceful arcs as petals falling through the air. A dance of beauty, but one mingled with a trace of sadness. Luna! She heard her beloved's voice calling her name. Whether real or merely an illusion conjured by her overwhelming desire to see him again, she could not tell. He was there, far off in the water, his image wavering and softly distorted by the current, as if revealing him to be no more than a mirage born of longing. His lips formed her name once more. Luna! Shouting her name, brow knit with desperation, he was seemingly on the verge of tears. She had seen him like this once before, on a day 12 years ago, when they'd still been children, when they'd only barely met. His expression and words now were a perfect echo of what they'd been then. His arm, too, was outstretched, as if he might bridge the great and growing distance between them. That was the day when the peace in her home of Tenebrae was suddenly shattered. Soldiers of the Niflheim Empire stormed Fenestala Manor and captured it, and then she was running, being pulled along by the hand. Failure to escape meant death, not for her, but for one more important than her, Prince Noctis. The title of Oracle was not yet hers, but she understood the duties of which she would be tasked. She was to aid the king of Lucis, the future king. That was her calling, as bestowed upon her by the gods, and she would see it fulfilled, even if that meant casting her own life aside. They will not be able to escape with me slowing them down. If he does not have to protect me as well, I know for certain His Majesty will be able to bring Noctis to safety. She released her grip on King Regis's hand. She was not afraid. There was only the ache of sadness, knowing she might never see Noctis again. But that was a small price to pay if it meant the prince would live. She watched as he was carried off into the distance. Not wanting to forget a single moment, she kept her head held high, eyes trained upon him and ears open. She saw his outstretched arm, reaching for her, and heard his desperate cries. She watched, unmoving, even as the Imperial host swarmed around her. Now, here in the ocean, she saw the face of the young boy, the same one long burned into the backs of her eyes, and superimposed upon it was the face of the adult. The time has come for us to part. For some reason, it was harder this time than it had been before. The old grief ached, ready to tear a hole straight through her. Why was it so difficult? She was older now. She'd come of age. Quite some time had passed since her ascension. So why did she feel like this? Why did she wish to cry like a small child? She bit her lip. Her king's last memory would not be of tear-stained cheeks. He would remember her happy. Gathering together every ounce of willpower she possessed, she put a gentle smile on her lips and silently outstretched her arm towards his. A blue flower was lightly clasped in her hand, one of the scilla blossoms she loved so much. I give this flower to you. This is sure to be our final moment. When the world falls down around you, and hope is lost, when you find yourself alone amidst a lightless place, look to the distance. Know that I am there, and that I watch over you always. Farewell, dear Noctis. He flailed in the water. Their outstretched hands drifted apart. It was so like that other day, all those ages ago, and yet this time they drew apart slowly, almost gently. She felt grateful to the sea, for there, immersed in its water, Her tears could not be seen. And with that same gentle momentum, she continued to sink, deeper and deeper, to a place that would never know the rays of the sun. I can cry now, she told herself, for no matter how loudly I wail, I needn't worry that Noctis might hear. A kind voice interrupted her thoughts. Let not sorrow overwhelm. She knew the voice well, for it had been at her side since she was very young. Sleep now, just for a little while, Gentiana continued. Gentle fingertips softly lowered her eyelids as they'd done so many times in the past. Somehow, Gentiana always knew. It had been a mysterious constant of her childhood. Whenever Luna woke late at night, troubled by frightening dreams, the messenger was there. Mother and Ravis would be sound asleep, but Gentiana would be at her bedside, coaxing her back into slumber. She still ached with grief, but the loneliness and worry lifted as though they'd never been there. Tranquility bathed her mind under Gentiana's soothing hands, and she allowed herself to be carried away by sleep. It was a mysterious sleep, not unlike a shallow afternoon repose. She hung in the space between dream and consciousness, and everything radiated warmth. Thought no longer held shape. Time was forgotten. There was nothing left but the tender, nebulous hands of warmth gently cupped around her. How much time had passed like that? Suddenly, she felt her body rising. It was not a comforting sensation. Instead, it was a stark, jolting difference from the hazy warmth of before. Slightly disorienting, like being woken up. No, she was waking. She felt a distinct weight against her eyelids and forced them open. A wave of prickling sensations and then pain came rolling in. Her mouth opened, hungry for air, only to find foul-tasting liquid. She realized she was underwater and flailed her arms about, grateful to find firm ground below and the surface not far away. She sat up, freeing herself from the water's embrace, and coughed repeatedly. The shallows in which she found herself would have been difficult to describe as clean by any measure. Her eyes stung, streaming tears as she blinked the water's dirty residue away. "Where am I?" she asked aloud, half to prove to herself this was not another dream. One hand came to her throat as she spoke. The clear vibration of the words brought further proof. This was reality, true and certain. Finally, when her eyes were clear, she looked about. The world was dim and her surroundings hard to discern. The air was cloyingly humid, and she heard the sound of something else, something not liquid, spilling to the ground at intervals. Is that sand? If not sand, it was certainly of similar quality. Fine grains of something rained down from above. Her eyes slowly grew accustomed to the dimness, and she looked about. There was a hewn ceiling, but no windows, as far as she could tell. Not far away, she could see the edge of the shallow body of water she was now sitting in. Where in the world was she? It was not a building, but neither did she feel herself to be in some purely natural cavern. She couldn't say for certain because of the darkness, but some aspect seemed familiar. The thick odor, somewhere between moss and mold, and the way the chill hung in the air brought memories of long ago. A place she'd once visited had been like this. It, too, had been dim, but not so oppressive. Perhaps given the light of several braziers, the similarity would have become more apparent. Just what had that underground tomb been called? Rasilier. Just as the name came to her lips, another memory flashed to mind. She saw the Chancellor of Niflheim, Arden Izunia, eyes full of anger and hatred, and in his hand, a dagger. I'm alive? It seemed impossible. She remembered the indescribable pain as the dagger was driven into her side. She remembered the blood gushing from the wound and the fear as her consciousness slipped away. A hand unconsciously moved to her flank, where the blade would have entered. At the sight of the wound, she found an unnatural concavity of skin pulled tight, surrounded by a raised ridge of scar tissue. So her memory of being stabbed by Arden was truth. How, then, was she here, alive and well? An involuntary shudder coursed through her body, not prompted by such macabre thoughts, but rather by simple cold. Her arms trembled, goosebumps forming across her skin. When she attempted to rub warmth into them, she realized her clothes were soaked. She looked down. This was the dress she'd worn the day she was stabbed. It clung to her skin, torn in several places, stained and ruined. How could this be? She was supposed to be dead, but here she was, somehow transported to some mysterious underground space. It was all too much to fathom. "It's freezing," she said to herself. Her voice was small and wavering. Her teeth chattered. Pushing all her questions aside for later, she stood. She'd need to get out of here before she could do anything else. The world spun. She let out a small gasp, then found herself collapsed back on the ground, her left shoulder having taken the brunt of the fall. Standing hadn't been as easy as she'd thought. In fact, it was almost as if she'd forgotten how to walk at all. She rubbed her shoulder and tried once more, slowly and carefully. With a hand on one wall, she shuffled forward. She could feel a draft in the direction in which the air flowed. If she followed that, she'd find her way outside. After a few steps, strength seemed to return to her legs. As she walked, the heels of her boots clacked against the flagstones, and the sound continued to echo across the stone surfaces of the rooms and corridors. A little farther, and she felt certain she'd find a long stone stairway leading to the surface. Either that or a short slope leading upward to a higher level. All the tombs were built like this. They had to be, to accommodate the ceremonies when the dead were carried down to their final resting place. As Oracle, she'd visited a number of such places to perform the rites. Although the layout was not unfamiliar, this time there was no one leading the way with light in hand. Doubt formed in her mind. Suddenly, it seemed unlikely that her outward journey would be straightforward. She might wander here, lost in darkness, for some time. A sudden rustling noise reached her ears, along with the sensation of something like dry leaves underfoot. The clear, unsettling sound interrupted the steady clack of her heels and forced her to halt. She stood and groped at the ground, discovering the object at her feet to be an old, crumpled newspaper. Next to it was a small bundle like withered branches. A bouquet, most likely, brought as an offering to the dead who rested here. The newspaper must have been wrapped around the flowers. Lunafreya felt a flush of anger at the irresponsible soul who had left an offering on the floor rather than seeing it properly to the intended grave. She took the erstwhile bouquet and situated it properly on the stone coffin near where she stood, though not without some guilt. A gift of dry, withered stems seemed ill consolation for a departed soul. She began neatly folding the newspaper, intending to dispose of it once she reached the outside. It wouldn't do to leave rubbish behind in a tomb. When her eyes fell upon a small photograph on one page, though, her hands paused. "Noctis?" she gasped. Despite the photo's size, there was no mistaking his face. But in the darkness of the tomb, she couldn't hope to make out the words of the article. All she caught when she strained her eyes to read were the scattered phrases, "3rd year since the disappearance of," and "King of Lucis." When she looked up to find the date at the top of the page, she realized it had been torn away. "Noctis? Missing?" she whispered. "That cannot be." She tried to calm herself. She hadn't read the article properly yet. Perhaps it was not Noctis who had disappeared. 3 years ago, His Majesty King Regis would have been alive and well, she reassured herself. If the article was about the king, then... But how could she be sure Regis was king at the time the article was printed? 3 years ago from when? From today? When was today? How much time had passed? Another chill ran down her spine. Something vile was trying to crawl its way up her leg. She wanted to leave this place at once. She wanted desperately to be outside. She had to hurry. When she turned to continue on her way, she felt a tremor at her back. From over her shoulder, she saw a burst of debris rain down from the ceiling. Then another, and another. Each time, the quantity seemed to increase, a steady mix of gravel, dirt, and who knew what else. Something up above was trying to break through the ceiling. What that something was, she had not the faintest clue. Then the intruder was seeping in, some black, wispy thing that floated in the air, reminiscent of a worn and dirtied rag, and yet far more massive. As it broke through, it unfurled itself to fill the narrow passage, blocking her view of the newly formed hole, as well as the way from whence she'd come. A knot formed in Lunafreya's stomach. Her fears were soon confirmed. From the eerie dark mass stretched a huge pair of hands, if they could truly be called hands at all. Pale, bluish-white bone curved in great arcs, forming scythe-like claws. The havoc those claws could wreak was obvious at merely a glance. If there was a god of death in the world, this was undoubtedly the form it would take. But in truth, she knew it for neither reaper nor beast. It was a demon. Some type she'd not encountered before, but a demon nonetheless. She could faintly make out the telltale black miasma exuded from its billowing figure. Even when she'd ascertained as much, her body somehow failed to react. She had to run. If she did not, the creature would prove reaper enough. She knew this, but her legs only trembled, failing to afford her even one step to safety. She stood transfixed by the demon's 2 glowing eyes, like holes gouged out of darkness. As her body shook, she felt a scream rise within her chest. It tore from her throat, and then Luna Freya's curse of stasis was gone. She turned and ran, thinking of nothing but running as fast as she could. Up the incline of the tunnel, through the dark corridors, running, without a spare moment to even look back at her pursuer. If she slowed even slightly, she would be overtaken, and once she was in the grasp of those curved claws, it would all be over. Up. The only answer was up. Get to the surface, and if her luck was any good, it would be daytime, and the demon would be unable to follow. She still knew not whether the tomb she'd visited in the She still knew not whether the tomb was one she'd visited in the past, but it did not matter. The layout would be similar. There would be sloped tunnels, stairways, and small rooms cut into the stone, with crossroads running between them. A demon so large would not be able to squeeze through the crossroads. It might not even be able to push its way through one of the narrow stairways. As long as she stayed away from open spaces, she might have a chance. She might distance herself from her pursuer while still in the tomb. Finally, she spotted a narrow corridor, just wide enough for a single human to pass through. She darted in, then dared to spare a second to flick a glance over one shoulder. Just as she'd hoped, the massive black form hung unmoving at the mouth of the passage, a curtain blocking her view of anything beyond. It must be stuck, she thought. It cannot pursue any farther. She breathed a sigh, certain for a moment she was safe. But her relief was premature. A roar shook the corridor. Bits of rock showered down from overhead. Luna Freya's blood froze. This was the same monster that had ripped its way through a ceiling of stone. What desperation had allowed her to manage a corridor any manner of refuge? The demon seemed perfectly content to break the walls apart to reach her. If not shredded by its claws, she'd be buried under the rubble. Either way meant death. She continued to run, hell-bent on escape. The corridor sloped upward. Beyond that, she neither knew nor cared about the tomb's layout any longer. As long as she was moving up, as long as she was getting closer to the surface, nothing else mattered. Dull thuds echoed from behind her. No corridor or wall was going to stop the monster. She had to get outside. The ground at her feet shook violently. She tumbled, but felt no pain. There was no time. Any pause invited death. The demon's thrashing brought still more stones loose. Jagged shards fell from above, and the stairs began to crumble beneath her feet, but she pressed on, scrambling along somewhere between a run and a crawl. Then the oppressive smell of dirt and stone was gone. A chill wind brushed across her skin. Outside. She'd made it. No sooner did her mind register the fact than another tremor, accompanied by the deafening thunder of falling stone, sent her face down to the ground. The roar subsided, and Luna Freya nervously glanced back. The stairway into the earth was gone. The entire tunnel leading down into the tomb must have collapsed from the intensity of the demon's rampage. Nothing remaining to suggest she'd just emerged from an underground complex, or that one had even existed in this place at all. No, that wasn't quite true. This place was, without a doubt, a gravesite. A short distance away rested a water basin made of stone, and next to that grew a large old tree and a small plot of flowers. This was a spot to rest for those who came bearing offerings to place upon the graves of those they'd lost. Half of the tree's branches were gone. They'd been wrenched off and broken, and now they lay scattered among the roots as if telling the tale of some huge rampaging beast that had passed by this place. Luna Freya picked up one of the fallen branches that appeared longer and sturdier than the others. She grasped it tightly in her hand. It was not much more than a stick, but its length rivaled her own height, and would serve as a makeshift weapon for the time being. It was far better than walking through a nighttime gravesite unarmed. She began to walk, intending to hurry toward some safer location, when she realized she was missing one boot. It must have been lost during her panicked flight from the tomb. Just one of a pair would hardly serve swift progress, so the only option seemed to be abandon it and proceed barefoot. She would just have to find replacements somewhere along the way, preferably before some sharp stone or fragment of glass found its way into her soles. Perhaps by morning she'd have made it to some place well inhabited enough to offer shops. That last thought prompted her to cast a casual glance upward. That was when the realization hit. Something was off. She slowly turned around, sweeping her gaze across the sky, straining her eyes against the blackness. Is it not night? She wondered aloud. We're all very impressed with your motorcycle, sir. The dimness overhead suggested otherwise. It was not the dark brought on by dusk. There were no stars. There was no moon. But neither was it the black of a moonless night. The entire world was bathed in a gloomy, unnatural gray. When she looked harder, she saw flecks swirling through the darkened sky. It was unnerving. They were far too similar to another black mist she knew, the particles of miasma that emanated from demonic bodies. A shudder passed through her as she whispered, "What's going on?" In one direction, she saw an endless expanse of ice. In another, a vast, empty desert. Further afield was a forest of familiar profile. If these were the woods of her homeland of Tenebrae, then she had to be somewhere along the border of Sucarpe and Isulio. How odd. There was no trace of anyone else. The strip of land sandwiched between desert and tundra was not suited for planting, but she'd long heard of it functioned as a transit artery. She stood along a major thoroughway. Trucks and other vehicles should have been passing by day and night, and yet there was nothing but silence. The motorcycle confused everyone in chat, sorry. Which is interesting because, they could have waited like maybe a page or two more and then the sound would have been apt, but whatever. Not even an Imperial dropship overhead. 3rd year since the disappearance of... The newspaper's words rose in her mind. She'd expended her life to form the covenants with gods, and to see the ring of the Lucii to its rightful heir. Everything she'd done was for the sake of the true king and to ensure the future of their star. So what did this gray sky mean? In the span between the events in Altissia and now, what could have happened to their world? A roar shook the dim surroundings. She turned to find dust billowing from the remnants of the tomb, a tomb she thought crumbled and closed forevermore. Clumps of dirt and debris flew through the air, and then it was back. Grim death unfurled itself once more, tattered rags fluttering wide overhead. It was unthinkable. The collapse of the underground tomb should have surely been enough to see the demon trapped and destroyed. With the entrance gone, she had breathed a sigh of relief, certain that the immediate threat was past. Now that relief went spiraling away like debris from the tomb. The demon had emerged. Its hunt was not over. With precious moments already lost to thought, Lunafreya spun away, clods of dirt spraying from beneath her feet as massive claws swung behind her. It was a close call. The arc of the claws had passed no more than a hairbreadth from her back. Luck and naught else had kept her from being ripped to shreds. She might not be so fortunate the next time. Suddenly, she was glad to be barefoot, able to run much faster over the soil than she'd ever have imagined in the high heels she'd worn the day she'd been stabbed. She sprinted with all her might. The demon caught the top of one shoulder, nearly pulling her to the ground, but her luck held and she was somehow able to shake free. The blow sent her tumbling, but she sprang back up and continued to run. If she could make it to one of the main roads... She prayed for there to be at least one passing truck. It didn't matter where it was headed. If she could hitch a ride, she'd be safe, away from this awful place. She thought she heard the faint rumbling of an engine. The road had to be near. The muscles in her legs screamed in protest, but she carried on, unheeding. And then the ground was gone. Her feet found no purchase, and her body plummeted through empty air. Whether she'd gone straight over some ridge or met some sloping path, she did not know, but the world spun. Her body rolled and finally thudded to a halt. The sound of the engine grew closer. It was her 3rd stroke of luck in an otherwise unfortunate day. She had found her road and was now sprawled across it. She heard the screech of brakes and saw a motorcycle come to a halt mere inches from her nose. To one side of the wheel in her face, she spotted an attached sidecar. Lunafreya scrambled to her feet and threw herself into the unoccupied sidecar. The demon was still in pursuit. There wasn't time to ask permission. "What are you doing?" the driver demanded. Lunafreya couldn't make out any features beneath the helmet and goggles, but the driver's voice was clearly that of a young woman. Her garb seemed to indicate she was a hunter. Lunafreya tried to respond, but her breath came too heavy for clear words. I'm sorry, but... The driver audibly clicked her tongue. Lunafreya simply huddled deeper into her seat. Then the motorcycle and sidecar were in motion. The demon's claws were not far behind. "Damn it," the driver cursed. "I can't get this thing to go any faster with all the extra weight." "Right, extra weight. What should I dump?" Lunafreya said, her hands groping at the items underfoot. "Hey, no, I meant..." But Lunafreya had already caught the corner of a cloth bag in hand, a particularly large one crammed in the floor of the sidecar. She tugged it free and threw it in the face of the pursuing demon, knowing it was in vain, but desperate for any means to slow the monster down even the tiniest bit. The bag's contents spilled out over the roadway. Canned food. Hardly something to deem extra weight, she thought. "I was talking about you!" The driver shouted over the roar of the engines. "You're the extra weight!" "Oh no," Lunafreya muttered. "I'm sorry." The imposed ride brought guilt enough. Now she'd managed to cause her unwilling companion further trouble. That her actions were taken in haste was no excuse. The vehicle had a new load to bear, and the traveler was now without rations on which she'd doubtless been counting. Lunafreya tightly gripped the long tree branch from the gravesite. She would not be any more of a burden. She'd made it this far on her own, more or less. In truth, she had no confidence in her odds. She'd been no match for the pursuing demon, either in or out of the tomb. But there was no choice now. She'd have to face it. Lunafreya gripped the lip of the sidecar, intending to hop out. But a hand pulled her back in, and she dropped ungracefully into the seat once more. "Enough!" Enough with the dramatics, the driver seemed to mean. Lunafreya had been accepted along for the ride. "Just hang on tight and keep your mouth shut. It's going to be bumpy, and I don't want you biting your tongue." The engine revved higher, and Lunafreya was pressed back into her seat by a force of acceleration. The wind whipped against her, her hair streaming behind her like a veil. For a moment, it seemed like this burst of speed might see them to safety, but that hope was soon shattered. Lunafreya sensed the bluish-white hands reaching from behind. Then, before her mind could even process the attack, she was being lifted from the sidecar and slammed against the roadway. They'd hardly made it any distance down the road. Her left half felt heavy, numb. She gritted her teeth against the pain and rose to her feet. The motorcycle had already skidded to a stop, its rider hopping out, a shotgun in hand. From the way the younger woman held herself, it was clear she was no stranger to battle. "Get back. I'll deal with this," commanded the rider. Lunafreya shook her head in protest. The stranger was helping her when she could have kept going. If she hadn't stopped, she might have gotten away safely. Lunafreya owed it to help her fight. "What, you gonna give me a hand, then?" Lunafreya nodded. "Yes, I can fight." Inside, her confidence hardly measured up to her words. Would she truly be able to help against a demon so ferocious? Still, she felt that she had to fight. The stranger might know how to hold her own, but she'd not yet witnessed the strength and terror of this demon as Lunafreya had. This was not an opponent that could be taken down alone, without the aid of comrades. To Lunafreya's relief, the branch from the gravesite had rolled to a stop at her feet. Picking it up and hanging onto it had seemed somewhat silly at the time. Now she thanked her past self from the bottom of her heart. But when she bent to retrieve it, the stranger gave a snort of belief. "You've got to be kidding me." "You're going to fight using that?" the stranger continued. "Is your head on straight? Look, just don't get in my way, all right?" Lunafreya recalled her lessons. Years ago, as part of her training as Oracle, she'd learned how to fight with a polearm. She gripped her branch, adopting the proper stance for a spear, readying herself for the coming battle. "Just do as you were taught," she told herself. "Imagine that this branch is the trident." "Here it comes!" the stranger shouted. A report from the shotgun drowned out Lunafreya's response. The massive, writhing, black form twisted in the air. Lunafreya jabbed at it with the branch, aiming for the incoming claws. She felt her blow land, then thrust again. Once more, she felt it firmly connect. Her hits were landing. She was helping, or so she thought. Then too many things were happening at once, and when she could make sense of the world, it was her own body sprawled against the ground rather than the demon's. She scrambled to her feet, flustered. The shotgun sounded again, from mere steps away. The demon's movements were unbelievably swift, and little of the weapon's shot was finding its mark. Lunafreya leveled her branch and charged once more. If she could grab the demon's attention, she might provide her ally with an opening. Even a single moment might be enough. A shock ran up both her arms, and she let out a short cry of surprise. The branch, which should have been firmly in her grip, was spiraling away through the air, and the demon's claws were swiping in. "No!" she cried aloud, and in her mind, "I don't want to die. I refuse to. Not here. Not without any answers. Not without managing to help." Lunafreya flung both arms forward. She knew it was a futile gesture. This wasn't some harmless beast that might be driven away with her bare hands. And yet she stretched her arms forth anyway, filled with all her will and determination not to give in to death. She braced for the pain of being shredded apart, vividly recalling the agony she'd experienced before at the threshold of death. She shut her eyes. The sensation that arrived was something else entirely. "Shouldn't I be?" she whispered to herself. It was not pain. It was more of a tingling sensation, running from her fingertips up through her arms. When Lunafreya opened her eyes, the demon was shrinking back, writhing as if in pain of its own. What happened? More reports from the shotgun, and the demon's accompanying roars of pain shook the surrounding dimness. It seemed she'd somehow succeeded in stopping the demon's movements, but she wasn't quite sure how. It was all beyond comprehension. But she decided to try once more. Whatever it was she'd done, she had some idea of the sensation that had accompanied it, and a vague sense of how to make it happen again. The demon hung in the air, its motion slowed. She moved in close, fighting back the fear. This was not a time to hesitate. She extended her right hand, her mind focused on the tips of her fingers. "Remember what you felt," she commanded herself, but there was hardly a need. It came again almost automatically. The same puzzling force flowed freely through her arm. There was no need to coax it forth. If anything, it was smothering, overbearing, as if with a will of its own. And now with it came a clear, deep ache, spreading from her chest to the pit of her stomach. Lunafreya held her breath and weathered the pain. The gun sounded several more times, and the demon was writhing on the ground. Its features began to blur. "We're defeating it," Lunafreya thought to herself. "It's almost over." The sensation in her arms shifted. Before, it was as if something was flowing through them. Now, it was a far more disturbing feeling, as if hundreds of tiny insects were crawling about beneath her skin. A guttural noise tried to force its way through her gritted teeth. The demon continued to squirm on the ground. Just a little more and it would be gone. There was a grating screech, like metal against metal. She'd see this monster dead. She swore to it herself. "Hey!" the stranger shouted. "Ease up! You're going to get yourself killed!" Lunafreya ignored the words of caution and stretched her hands toward the demon once more. She steeled herself against a growing nausea. The stranger yelled, "Above you!" Lunafreya looked up. The claws were bearing down. Too close. She wouldn't be able to avoid them this time. The bluish-white scythes gouged deep into her upper arm. The pain ripped through her, an experience far worse than the crawling in her skin. And then, mere moments after delivering the devastating wound, the demon dispersed into a spray of black particles. It was defeated. The threat finally vanquished, Lunafreya's tense muscles relaxed. But her relief was cut short by another wave of crushing pain. She fell to her knees. "Are you all right?" the stranger shouted. Lunafreya nodded a lie. No, she was not all right, but in any sense of the words. Not in any sense of the words. The agony of her wound consumed her. Bile rose in her throat. "Hang on, I'll find something to stop the The stranger's words cut short with an audible gasp of surprise. Lunafreya's own breath caught too. Blood should have been pooling below her arm, but the flow had already stopped. Instead, the gaping wound emitted a sickly purple glow, along with telltale black flecks. The skin closed over before their very eyes. "What the hell just happened?" the stranger demanded, voice suddenly ripe with mistrust. Lunafreya could hardly blame the woman. They'd both seen the black flecks like that before. The sight of them could only lead to one line of thought. Miasma. Demons. Suddenly, Lunafreya was against the ground, with the barrel of a pistol hard against her cheek. "What are you? Some kind of monster?" After what she'd observed of her own body, Lunafreya found it difficult to argue otherwise. Her silence brought a harsh jab of the gun. "I asked you a question. What the hell are you? Answer me!" Lunafreya didn't know what to say, but if she failed to speak at all, her fate was apparent. She trailed off, unsure how to continue. Her mind was muddled, and then the feel of the cold metal was gone, and she heard the thump of a body hitting the hard surface on the road. Lunafreya hurried to right herself. "Miss, are you all right?" The stranger had clearly been full of murderous rage. Now she was crumpled on the ground, body limp. Lunafreya put a hand to the woman's throat and found a stable pulse. She removed the woman's goggles and saw slight twitches of movement under her eyelids. The stranger must have fainted from the hits she'd taken during the fight. Lunafreya loosened the collar of the woman's jacket, taking care not to jar her body. She spread a hand, thinking to ease the stranger's discomfort with her powers as oracle, then hesitated. The way she'd brought down the demon. What was that power? It was bizarre and unsettling. What if it happened again now? Did she still have her powers of healing at all? Lunafreya looked down at the palms of her hands. She ran her gaze along her arms. The gouges in her flesh had been deep, but now not even a scar remained. The wounds had healed over so cleanly it was as if they'd never been there at all. She had encountered no curative power like it before. In fact, she hesitated to think of it as curative at all. There had been those awful black particles clustered over the site of the wound. Could they truly be what she thought they were? Lunafreya had no answers, and one mystery still troubled her above all others. Why am I alive? She wondered to herself again. In that darkness that was not night, Lunafreya's hopes, too, seemed bleak. So how you guys doing? Choosing freedom is off to a hell of a start. That was about a wild half hour. Alright, let's keep going. The young woman was a walking armory. Lunafreya was half disturbed and half amazed. When she unfastened the stranger's jacket, intending to check over her for wounds in need of attention, she found an astonishing amount of weaponry. Her eyes involuntarily darted over it all. Spare magazines, several knives she could only assume were meant for throwing, grenades hooked to a belt, and numerous cylindrical containers of varied sizes, whose purpose Lunafreya could not begin to fathom. On the woman's shoulders were several holsters, a gun carefully secured in each. Given the stranger's tone before fainting, confiscating the weapon seemed the reasonable precaution to take. Lunafreya was not anxious to find a gun pressed to her head again. But the quantity of weapons and munitions posed a problem. Even if she were to take them, where would she hide them all? In the end, she resigned herself to not tampering with the stranger's belongings. She might find herself staring down a barrel once more, but she'd cross that bridge when she came to it. Eventually, the stranger woke. Her first action was predictable. She quickly distanced herself from Lunafreya and readied one of her many guns. "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" she demanded. The fact that she hadn't shot first and asked questions later was promising. She'd even asked for Lunafreya's name. There seemed to be a glimmer of hope. "My name is Lunafreya Nox Fleuret." The stranger continued to glare at her, but Lunafreya noticed a small, uncertain shift in her gaze. That's the name of the Oracle, the one who's been dead for 10 years. So I did, in fact, die, Lunafreya thought. But aloud, she found herself questioning the claim. "A decade ago?" she asked. The question reminded her of another pressing uncertainty. She withdrew from her dress the bit of newspaper from earlier, unfolded and smoothed it out, then held it aloft. "Please tell me, do you know anything about this?" Perhaps the young woman could shed some light on the article's contents. Gun still leveled, she approached close enough to snatch the paper from Lunafreya's hands, then stepped back and studied it warily. "Weird thing to ask," she muttered. Then, "Geez, weird thing to carry around, too. If they're saying the king's been gone for 3 years, this must be, 6 or 7 years old? The king is gone?" Lunafreya's thoughts whirled. "Noctis missing? How? Why?" The stranger continued. "Yeah, nobody's seen trace of him for a solid decade." Lunafreya felt herself grow dizzy, on the verge of fainting from this new revelation. It seemed impossible. Her last memory was of Altissia, the covenant with Leviathan. She'd been prepared to sacrifice her life that the king might receive the Tide Mother's blessing. Lunafreya had already realized the weakness in her body. She knew the ritual would mean the end for her, even had Arden Izunia not come with dagger in hand. But death had not mattered. She'd opened the way for the future of their star. The king would dispel the darkness that plagued Eos. The promise would be fulfilled. But now, she looked up. Darkness shrouded the sky. This was not the black of night. It was sinister, ominous. What had happened to their world? The rider's patience was wearing thin. "Are you really the Oracle?" she demanded. "Or are you some demon posing as human? If you're really who and what you say you are, give me some proof." I do not know that I have any, Luna Freya responded. She pressed a hand to the scar on her flank. Even over the cloth of her garments, it was easy to feel the raised flesh. There was no pain from the wound, though it seemed so recent in memory. If this wasn't the scar from her stabbing, what was it? I don't know anything, Luna Freya confessed. Why I'm here, what this power is, or why I'm alive. She cupped her hands and covered her face. Just one answer. That was all she wanted. But she received nothing. No one could explain what's going on. Look, the stranger said, voice suddenly soft. I just want to know one thing. Luna Freya looked up at her. Can I trust you? Once again, Luna Freya stared down the barrel of steel, but the stranger's eyes were no longer those of a killer. The question was sincere. I'm afraid I cannot say with certainty, Luna Freya responded. Why not? I have no way to prove to you that I am who I say. She did not want to lie. The stranger stared at her, and she felt compelled to stare right back. Luna Freya held her eyes open wide. The gun barrel lowered, but instead of relief, Luna Freya felt her knees begin to tremble. She'd been so on edge, she hadn't even recognized her own fear. Just remember this, the stranger added. One wrong move, and you're dead. The gun was back in its holster. A sigh escaped Luna Freya's lips. If you want to show me you're trustworthy, I could use a hand pushing the bike. This looks like more of a repair job than I can handle here on the road. The driver looked back at Luna Freya and added, This is mostly your fault, you know. I'd be happy to, Luna Freya responded. Miss, She realized she had not yet asked the stranger's name. Soul, the stranger answered. It was unclear whether that was a surname or a given name, or perhaps some manner of nickname, but Luna Freya nodded. Come on then, Lady Oracle. Let's get going. She hoped, at the very least, they'd found trust enough for the stranger not to give a false name. Oh, I've got a message a little bit ago. Twitch is fucking up 50 ways from Sunday. Let me check. Twitch. Okay, it's fine now. Okay. I was gonna head over to Down Detector and make sure everything was okay. Waiting for another message from my mod. She's a tippity tippin'. Oh, Jesus. So, Luna has run into an 18-year-old Solana Aldercopt Antiquum. This is concept art for Soul, and this is sadly the only art we have for Soul beyond her younger model. They originally wanted her, as you can see, to have kind of like a lance hand prosthetic, and like for her to have like lost part of her arm. But they decided that they would rather Soul be a gun-toting walking armory, but her clothing is about the same. She just doesn't have the lance arm. But yeah, this is Soul all grown up, and you can see the Aldercopt crest hanging from her belt. So, this is Arenea's little baby girl. All grown up. Yeah. Yeah. So, Luna awoke from the dead. And, what happened with that demon was pretty, stressful. Pretty alarming. And, yeah, she was lucky enough to run into Soul. So, Soul has there is a concept art of it. I didn't want to put it in here, but there's concept art of, Soul. She has a motorcycle and, a sidecar. It's really cute. So, episode Luna is The Adventures of Luna and Soul. And Luna just sits in the little sidecar. It's very cute. Soul was breathing hard. "You're a lot stronger than I would have guessed," she remarked, flicking a glance at the self-proclaimed oracle as they pushed the poor, busted three-wheeler down the road. "That's very kind of you to say." The stranger, Luna Freya, was speaking in the same short, concentrated bursts that just left me kind of dizzy. They were both gasping for air, a clean sign of the effort it was to push the vehicle along the road. She's a lot stronger than she looks, Soul thought, feeling a bit perplexed. So, Soul obviously doesn't have a voice in-game, but... So I'm giving her a voice that I want, and I hope you guys think it suits her. Because she doesn't have one in-game. Obs. When she'd asked the woman to give her a hand, her expectations weren't exactly high. Pushing the bike was obviously going to be an effort well beyond her. Not that the woman's shabby attire was doing her any favors, but from the way she spoke and conducted herself, Soul could tell she'd had a pretty posh upbringing. Still, when they righted the motorcycle and its sidecar, and when they began rolling it down the road, Soul quickly realized the woman was pulling her own weight. Come to think of it, she'd held her own, more or less, during the fight with the Death Gaze, too. She'd held her stick as if it were a real polearm, and her movements were those of someone trained to fight. Frankly, the woman was suspicious with a capital S. Who went around claiming to be the Oracle? And that spell or whatever she'd used against the demon? And the wound. Now here she was, blithely pushing away like nothing had happened, like a Death Gaze hadn't just sunk its claws right into her arm. Soul had been staring straight at the wound when it closed up. It was weird. Creepy as hell, she thought.